and just let them in, but I think we'll get started. So firstly, just to sort of say, we are recording this session in order that we can share it with CUBO members more widely afterwards. So speak now or forever hold your peace on that one. My name is Robin Walsh. I'm the head of residential services at Bournemouth University. It's my day job, but also involved with CUBO as on their executive board as their lead for housing codes and standards. And we are here today to listen to Tim, who's here on the call with the headphones on. You can see with that very nice door behind him. He was just telling us about. It's not. I thought it was one of those kind of backgrounds that you get. I was so impressed, but it's an actual door. So Tim is, as you might know Tim, he's the founder and CEO of GSL, and he's the brains behind the information and the data that we're going to hear about today. We have actually presented and talked about this already at the Summer CUBO conference. So some of you may have been at the conference, but I'm guessing that most of you probably haven't, which is why you're here today to get the lowdown on meeting the diverse needs of international students. So this was a joint CUBO and GSL collaboration, because we wanted to produce a report to provide a high-level view of PBSA and university accommodation. The data dates back to the spring of this year, so it's very recent and current. And the initial report looked at the differences between university and private halls, but what we're particularly interested in today is the detail that the report, the survey went into, looking at the experiences of the 3 largest cohorts of international students who study and live in the UK, and that is the students from China, India and Nigeria, whose numbers continue to grow. I was just looking at the Home Office website earlier today, and looking at the data from June 23, that in India, looking at the number of study visas that have been granted, and India interestingly tops out with 143,000 study visas granted, China 107,000, and Nigeria 57,000. So we really are sort of focusing on the key cohorts here. So it should be really interesting to hear from Tim what we've got to say about those students. So I think I'm going to hand over now to Tim. The idea, I guess, will be Tim's going to present the data. Hopefully you've got some questions already. If you haven't, do note your questions down. You can put them into the chat. We can sort of pick up questions as we go, or at the end we'll kind of open it up into a conversation, and you guys can ask Tim some questions, or we can get a conversation going between all of us. Excellent. So if that all sounds good, I'm going to hand over to Tim right now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robin. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Yeah, I'm quite happy from a Q&A point of view. We'll obviously have time to do it at the end. If you think of something as I'm talking about it, feel free to throw a question. I'll keep the meeting chat open so I can see them. If I think, that's a complicated one, we'll deal with that at the end. I might just ignore it temporarily. Don't take offense. Sorry. And also, I've got back to school cold. Kids are 3 kids all back at 3 different schools. I've got all the diseases incoming in my household, sadly. So apologies if I mute for a second. You'll know why. Okay. So let me get I guess the pitch out of the way early on, just for those of you who don't know about the Global Student Living Index, which is where this data is drawn from in this report. It's the leading accommodation experience survey globally now, operating across 4 continents, and I think with something like approaching 15 different languages as well to cover those 4 continents. Obviously, that's a lot of data, and it's a really powerful source of benchmarking. So if you're not currently participating in the index, please do consider doing so. Get in touch, and your data could be helping to produce some more of these reports in collaboration with CUBO in coming years. This is the first of a series of GSL reports in collaboration with CUBO, this one focusing specifically on the UK and Irish market, The report really is in two parts. I think we were feeling a bit greedy. We kind of had two things we wanted to achieve, and we just decided to do both of them. So the first part is that we really wanted to publish some solid baseline data looking at the student experience of PBSA as a whole in these markets, which kind of covered in the first half of the report. And then the second half, as Robin mentioned, we take a deep dive into three specific international student cohorts, as the Chinese, Indian, and Nigerian students. And the reason we felt it was important to do that is because, as you know, and as Robin has mentioned, there are significant shifts underway in the composition of our international student population. And we want to explore what the effects of those shifts might be, how we need to prepare for them, and how their needs are going to change. So we'll definitely cover that in plenty of detail. So the evidence presented in the report is based on a sample of 43,000 students right across the UK and Ireland. Including a large chunk of international students, which we then split out into those three particular cohorts. The survey responses, these are all fully completed end-to-end survey responses. We never use incomplete survey responses, and we never use blended data from other sources and things that you might find elsewhere. As well as some of the challenges the report raises, there's quite a lot of good news. So I'm probably going to focus on the good news stuff first, and then we'll kind of get into more of the nitty-gritty detail. It's all positive. There's nothing dreadful in there, but it's nice to have some broad good news to start a presentation with. So I guess to start with, the first point to make is, and it's a well understood point, I think, but the chart illustrates it really nicely, is that accommodation has never been more important in decisions that students make about where to go to university, and it's increased year on year, and this is particularly true for international students, where it's even more important than that chart suggests. So it's really important, of course, that you guys make sure that your institutional partners know just how important it is, and how important therefore you are, and how important all the things you do are. And that's not just about on-campus provision, of course, with a particular hat tip to Robin. It's about the overall provision of accommodation for students choosing where they go to study. It is super, super important, and especially for certain international student cohorts. This is a chart looking at overall satisfaction over time, split by university halls and private halls. The first thing you'll notice about it is it's very wobbly. And the reason for that, I will just highlight. What's the best way of highlighting it? I'm going to use the highlighter original. Is that the waves here alternate between Q2 and Q4. So we go Q2, Q4, Q2. So Q2 is obviously spring. That's the kind of what we call the exit wave in the Northern Hemisphere. And Q4 is obviously the entry wave in the Northern Hemisphere where we are. And it's a typical pattern to see scores drop slightly from entry to exit. So that's why you get this sort of wobble effect. But if you look at the overall trend, we've actually, and you can pick out the COVID years in there, satisfaction levels are now generally higher than pre-COVID, which is fantastic achievement. And also the gap between university halls that you can see in blue and private halls in green has closed in the last couple of years, which I think is really interesting. Now, this gap between university halls and private hall satisfaction measures is always a bit contentious, and one of the challenges that we often put to us about it is, about the relative age and condition of the stock that we're comparing between, say, the university run stock and the private stock. And that this is a bit of an aside, but that's an issue we've been working on for a couple of years, and our research team have actually now devised a way to distinguish between satisfaction outcomes that are due to the condition of the building, and those that are can be attributed to the operational performance of the building. So there's some, I'm not going to go into it in this presentation, but there's some more about it in the report, and we can explain more about that separately. What it allows you to do is essentially say, for a given building at a given condition level, this is our operational target, and we are above or below that. And that allows you to start comparing portfolios that are of different ages, and just see how your operational performance isolated is doing. So I was getting a bit technical, but it's starting to address some of that, and we'll no doubt be using that in some future reporting that we do with CUBO, because it's absolutely fascinating. And if you're a university, as I'm sure most of you are, there's some quite cheering news in there for you about how well you guys do compared to your private counterparts. Anyway, so that's some good news. And obviously the satisfaction in the report, we split it out a number of different ways. This is just looking specifically at university halls. You can see there are some significant differences within the nations of the UK and across mission groups. So Alliance and Guild HE, and obviously, some of these mission groups, whether they formally or don't formally exist anymore, we kind of know what we're talking about, hopefully. Alliance and Guild HE lead the way. Their Russell Group institutions have really been catching up in recent years, and a lot of investment there in student wellbeing and soft services that have really made a difference. Worth saying that Million Plus Group at the tail of the field there is impacted by typically more urban settings, some older stock that's still relatively expensive for those that live in it, and the demographics of the students obviously plays an impact as well. But all of that really goes to show that actually picking the right benchmarks to measure yourself against is super important, whether it's mission group or it's campus setting or it's institution size. So obviously, if you are interested in getting involved in the index project, we can help you pick out what are the right benchmarks to be measuring against. But it's useful to see that split across the whole sector. More positive news in relation to student struggles. So the proportion of students who say they've seriously considered dropping out, and we do use the word seriously in the question, it's quite important because you'll get very different figures for this depending on the question you ask, and we obviously stick to a question that we track year on year. So the proportion of students who say they have seriously considered dropping out has fallen slightly. Some of the other struggles have fallen more significantly just in the past year, which is obviously great news. You can see that figures on struggling with workload, stress, anxiety, work-life balance. The numbers are still higher, I think we can say, than any of us would like. We'd like to see most of those numbers come down quite a lot, but that the direction post-COVID recovery, it feels exhausting to still be talking about COVID, and hopefully we're not going to be talking about it much more, touching all the wood. There's positive movement there. We'll come on to sort of how these struggles differ for different international cohorts a little bit later. The next piece of good news, and maybe a piece of good news that you might find quite surprising, across all PBSA, private and university run, is that more students than ever say that their accommodation offers good value for money, despite we know some significant price increases recently. And more on entry. This will be interesting to see how these figures change in this upcoming wave that we're about to run in sort of October through December, which we might report back through CUBO, perhaps, if people are interested on how that's shifted, because everyone's curious about at what point does the students start pushing back on value for money, not just kind of pure affordability. Well, at the same time as students being broadly very positive about value for money, 37% say they're struggling to find part-time work this year. That's significantly up, and that's a need for part-time work, and then obviously struggling to actually find it. And there are other indicators as well in the data and in the report that managing day-to-day spend, day-to-day budgeting is a real challenge for students. We all know about the cost of living crisis. We all know that actually the most basic foodstuffs, the ones that students will often gravitate towards, are the ones that have been most impacted with effective inflation rates way above the headline figures. A packet of rice, a packet of plain budget pasta. Those are the things where inflation has sort of, in some cases doubled the prices of some of those staple goods. So that is an issue. And at first glance, these things seem contradictory, but there's a really important insight to understand here, which is that despite those day-to-day budgeting issues, students and perhaps their parents have remained willing to invest in high quality accommodation despite the increased costs. So those day-to-day budgeting challenges and the struggle to find part-time work are real. And as we'll see in a moment, the part-time work issue has a particular impact on some international groups. So the second part of the report is structured around profiles, if you like. There's a section on looking at international students overall, and then there's profiles, 3 profiles, one for Chinese students, for Indian students, and for Nigerian students. Now, obviously, within Chinese students, there's going to be diversity. Within Indian students, there's diversity within each of these groups. That given, we have to kind of draw a line somewhere. the first step in that is breaking international students apart. And what do we mean international students? What do these different cohorts actually look like? At the beginning of each of those profiles, there's these little stat summaries that I've got on the chart there. And I just want to draw your attention to something important here. And I would say, in fact, if there is only one thing I'd really like you to take on board from this whole presentation, it's this specific thing. So hopefully everyone's sat up and paying full attention here. If you take a close look at how these students are funding their accommodation, you will begin to see why thinking of international students as one homogeneous block is so ineffective. So let's look at Chinese students to begin with. Their rent funding. 91% of Chinese students are getting at least some funding from parents. Only 3% intend to fund through part-time work. For Indian students, 20% intend or are funding their accommodation at least partly through part-time work, and only 60% are getting support from parents. And for Nigerian students, it's less than half. Fewer than half of Nigerian students are getting parental support with their accommodation costs, and more than 40% need part-time work to pay for their accommodation. And when you start to think about the implications of that for student engagement, for the way they interact with other students, for the kind of services and support you need to provide, for their worries and stresses, the things they think about and worry about, for their academic outcomes, you can start to see how just that alone has a huge influence on the different needs of and attitudes of different international student cohorts. And there are many other differences highlighted in the report, so I'll touch on a few more. So, for example, we look at what's most important to international students, well, to all students really, when they're choosing accommodation. And all these factors are important to different degrees. But for example, international students are are twice as likely. International students as a group are twice as likely as students from the UK to prioritise living on their own. And actually, that figure is much higher still for Chinese students, about 60% for Chinese students. That's a priority in their search. And we'll touch on that and the implications for social engagement in a second, because I think there's some really interesting stuff to understand there as well. Kitchens is another interesting one. So kitchens are really important for everybody. Everybody's kitchen size and facilities is quite important. People understand the sort of social nature of kitchens and things, but it's particularly true for Indian students. Kitchen size and facilities more important, particularly for Indian students, also for Nigerian students, but particularly for Indian students. It's important for everyone as a baseline, but if you're targeting Indian students, if you need to understand what they want and need, kitchen size facilities are much more important for them than for other groups. Communal spaces, some more interesting differences there. Much a high priority for both Indian and Nigerian students than for others. And again, the report touches on that and goes on into that in a little bit more detail, and we'll cover it a little bit in the presentation in a moment. How that relates to social needs and the, I guess, apparent contradiction with demands for living on your own and historic demands for ensuite accommodation, those sorts of things. So this demand for communal spaces leads us nicely on to looking at social experience in a little bit more detail. So despite or maybe because international students prioritize living on their own, they are much more likely to demand more social events. So much so, in fact, 15% of Nigerian students and more than 10% of Indian students say they would actually pay for improved social events. And people don't volunteer in a survey. They don't tell you they'd be willing to pay more for something very easily. I can tell you that from lots of pricing studies and lots of price modeling projects, is if somebody says they're genuinely willing to pay more, and they're not saying how much more, but it's really not a question of actually a practical question of whether that's something you charge for. It's really a measure of the significance of the deficit, if you see what I mean, like how much that's important to them. And I think this is another important insight, because it's true for Chinese students as well. The drive towards privacy, if you like, living on my own, or en suites at one particular example of that, that drive is not an antisocial instinct. It's about security. And then given the security needs are met, and that's either because people get what they want, an ensuite, for example, I mean, not ensuite, but a studio, for example, they feel super secure. They either get the sense of security that way, or they don't get the studio, but they end up actually feeling or realizing that actually they do feel reasonably secure in the accommodation anyway. Provided that security need is met, they then want the socialization. It's a mistake to think that because someone is choosing a room type or a method of living that appears to have more privacy, that therefore they don't want to socialize. Those are two entirely distinct needs. They are different parts. There are different places on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they still need both. There's actually also some really good evidence in the report, which I would recommend going and reading through and digging out this stuff around the size of buildings and how the size of buildings impacts the social experience, particularly for Nigerian students. There is an issue around, it appears to be an issue, it's a hypothesis, around reaching a kind of critical mass of students of a particular background for those students to feel, to have a head start in terms of feeling a sense of belonging where they are. And that's why for domestic students, there's a particular size of building that seems sort of optimal for their social engagement and for outcomes. But then for Nigerian students, that optimal size is actually slightly larger, and we think that's to do with that kind of critical mass of finding other Nigerian students or other international students in the same building. So question from Paul: is the demand for private space distinct in the survey between ensuite, which I would class as communal living, and studio flats, which I would class as private, self-contained? So we asked completely separately. So interesting point, Paul, because actually we talk about both bedroom type. You could argue it's a bathroom type, really, about whether ensuite, shared bathrooms, for example. We also capture data on private rooms, shared room, studios. And so one of the weird sort of things of that is, if you look at the data specifically for, say, Chinese students on the demand to live on their own, it's actually sort of drops down, because the real demand is to live specifically in a studio. So there's a sort of, I want that specific type of private living, not that type of private living. So but we do pick that apart in the report, and we do address those things separately. Hopefully that's answered your question. Okay. So social activity. Okay, so what do they really want? Well, as always, when it comes to social activity, there's more work and more research to do on that, and it is one of the topics we are thinking about exploring in more detail for next year. So if you are interested in us digging into that in a lot more detail, theming it out and doing maybe more tests on whether people would actually engage with it, or whether it's just an idea of people's head, do flag it up, let us know. If there's other things equally that you'd like us to explore in future reports, also please let us know. So there is more work needed to do on that, but there are two common themes that arise repeatedly and are illustrated, I think, fairly efficiently by these two quotes. The first is themes around food. Food, of course, important in all cultures, but it is such a huge thing for Chinese students and the Chinese community that it really deserves special attention. And it's something that comes up very, very frequently from Chinese students. Activities around food share sums it up, but all sorts of different models of doing that. And interestingly, in some sort of newer PBSA developments that we see, particularly in mainland Europe, in some markets in Spain, seen as in Portugal, an increasing frequency we're seeing what I would call show kitchens, but they're professionally kitted kitchens that you can actually book out as a group of students and cook together. You can do your own master chef. They're proper top end kit. So you've got your standard kitchens or whatever the setup of the building layout is, but then there is a bookable, beautifully shiny professional kitchen. You're responsible for returning it to the state it was in when you book it out. And they're incredibly popular. Simon's pointing out that Eleanor Rosa in London has this, yes. Very, very popular communal facility. So food's a massive thing. And the second theme really is international students connecting with and expressing their identities while they're away from home. I love that comment. You know, you get comments in surveys, you sometimes get, you tend to get sort of really long essays. You know, someone's got a lot of things they want to say, or you get 2-word answers. I love the short, pithy ones. Like Nigerian party just says it all for me. I'm there already. You know, and maybe if we're worried about, you know, if we do these things, will we get the integration we want? Maybe we need a bit of creative thinking, and if there's a Nigerian party with some Chinese food in it, I don't know, maybe everyone's happy. I'm sure it's a bit more complicated than that, but these two themes, and I think are recurring, as I've said. You know, this is a bit of my hobby horse. I've been on calls and podcasts and done presentations and roundtable sessions before, a lot on sense of community and building community and student accommodation. And one of the things I think is a common mistake that happens when any operator goes about with a strategy of how to build community is that they skip over the building block of community, which is first a sense of belonging. If you want, and this is my hypothesis, my thing, I firmly believe that if you want to build strong communities, you can only do that on top of a sense of belonging. You cannot build a community to coalesce a group of people, none of whom feel they belong there. It doesn't work. So international students need that security. We talked about that desire for private room, studio, whatever it is. They need that security. They need also a sense of belonging. And the easiest and most obvious way of getting that is with affinity with other students from where you're from. That's the easiest way. You can achieve that in other ways, and you can compensate. And you kind of have to if you've got, you know, if you've got students from countries where there isn't a huge number of them coming over, or Nepalese students, which are really important inbound market, but they're not vast numbers of them. You know, you need to find other ways of helping students find that sense of belonging. And then with that sense of belonging, that foundation in place, then you can foster a more integrated sense of community. Happy to have an argument in a pub with anybody around that, because it's just my particular hypothesis, but I think it does stand up to most of the sort of data that we look at that about why those kind of community building things do or don't succeed. Right, slight tangent there, apologies. So this is my final kind of pre-prepared slides. I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. I'm hoping you guys are feeling chatty, but we'll find out. So I'm just going to skim over this slide a little bit. Within the report, again, goes into much more detail. We're looking at self-reported mental health struggles. So you can see on this chart, I've got a highlight there, that Indian students in particular struggle with homesickness. So that's something to really look out for. But across some of the other aspects, it's actually domestic students who report higher levels of these challenges. What I would say, however, is that culture influences responses to mental health questions a lot. For the Chinese, for example, there is nowhere near the same kind of delineation between mental and physical health concepts as we imagine in the UK. Most of us have quite a disconnected sense of mental health and physical health, and the Chinese culturally that is not a thing quite so much. And that does mean that, I guess from a practical point of view, using terms like mental health in the way that you engage with international students isn't necessarily going to be the best way to engage with them. It's not to say you're ignoring mental health, but actually, if you're trying to address specific struggles, you may need to address those specific struggles directly, rather than trying to sort of scoop everything under sort of mental health and well-being, which maybe increasingly works for us as an understanding of a large sort of bucket of related issues, doesn't necessarily work that way in the minds of international students. And so there are recommendations in the report relating to that as well. So to wrap up the presentation element of this session, the composition of our international student base is changing. In some institutions, it has already changed radically in a couple of years. Some of you may be from those institutions. There are going to be more shifts. Shifts are going to continue, but I think the overall theme is there's going to be more and more diversity. Robin's talked about the latest numbers of these 3 particular cohorts, but we're seeing new markets. We're going to see the leading markets share, effectively their share kind of diluted slightly as other markets come to bear, as the Nigerian market has done and entered. So we're going to have more diversity in future. And to be able to serve residents well, we need to understand our institution's recruitment strategy. Some of you may argue that our institution's recruiters don't understand their recruitment strategy, but that's for a separate conversation. We need to do our best to understand what the strategy is and the likely impact it's going to have on international student recruitment, not just the number of international students, but the composition, which markets we're going to be drawing students from. And we're going to need to understand alongside where that mix might be going, because it's going to be very different for different institutions. We're going to need to understand the diverse needs of those different international student cohorts in order to be able to respond as that student mix changes and be a bit more dynamic. And that's not just in terms of the way that we deliver kind of soft services. That's also about the accommodation mix. That's about which of these blocks are we offering to the late booking Indian business school students? Which of these blocks is the more suitable one to put aside? You need to understand the profile of the students you're bringing in to understand how best to serve them, because there are significant differences even at the nationality level. And in the future, of course, we may even start to dig below that. So hence that kind of conclusion, which is hopefully fairly obvious to all of you, having seen some of that data, that there really is no such thing as an international student, and the sooner we can stop talking about international students as a group, the better. A couple of QR codes for you on there before we get into any further Q&A. So I don't know whether there's the left one is a link to download the report. It's on the CUBO website. So if you don't want to QR code it, you can just go to the CUBO website. It's in the Knowledge Hub resources page, I think it's called. And the link on the right is for more information about the Global Student Living Index, if your institution might be interested in getting involved in that and sharing some of the data and benchmarking that comes out of that. Great. So I guess I'll open the floor to questions, either from you, Robin, or from anybody else who's in the session.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim. I mean, I'm scratching down thoughts. I mean, there's so much in this report. You just kind of like, as you're sort of talking through, I'm just thinking of questions, and then you start talking about the next bit, and you're like, oh, there's more there. It's such a dense area of that needs a lot of consideration. And I think really strikingly for me is this. I remember the first time I read the report, and you can't that everybody's different, but there was just such an easy it's just an easy approach just to talk about home students and international students. I think for a lot of people, and I'm not speaking for everybody, and there might be people on the call that said, oh no, I never thought of them like that, but it was just too easy to think of international students as one mass cohort. And I think what this report for the first time really clearly shows in great detail is that they're really not. And actually, within the Chinese, the Indian, Nigeria markets, even within those particular cohorts. There's obviously going to be there's difference there as well, and I think just the recognition of that's where we have to start thinking at that level of detail is just sort of the main takeaway for me from this report. That's before we really start to get into the nitty gritty of it. So, I mean, I'd say I've got some thoughts myself, but I just kind of wanted to open up for other people really, because I know we've had a chance to talk about this before, Tim. So I want to kind of sort of see what other people were thinking, if there's any sort of main sort of things that this has prompted their thinking, or perhaps they've seen something in the report thing, actually, yeah, that rings true for our institution, or maybe it doesn't ring true for our institution. So out to the group really. Anybody want to jump in with any questions or thoughts? Don't need to. I mean, it's fine. I mean, I kind of sort of, to get started really. I mean, I just I guess the one of the big challenges that I see for institutions is the need for, I mean, we've seen a huge growth in international students, particularly with the the change to the visa rules that happened recently, and over the last couple of years since those visa rules have been changed, we've seen a dramatic increase in particularly in the Indian and Nigerian markets, and I guess that, cynically for me, when I look at that, the reason for that happening politically, I think, and I'm happy to be challenged by this, but I think that I'm quite cynical when it comes to what the government's doing. But I think the practical realities that they saw of higher education, the way higher education is funded, they recognise that the value of the home tuition fee being frozen since 2016 was reducing, and actually the only way that they could sort of manage the finances of higher education without further funding from the government, which we know is just not going to happen, is by opening the doors back up to the international markets, where the tuition fees are obviously now seen as a way to sort of to top up the loss on the home fees. So I think that I don't know. Do you agree with that, Tim?
100%, but it's fragile, isn't it? Ultimately,
Yeah.
it's especially when it comes to those sorts of nuanced visa schemes with families, without families, post-work rights. These things are at the whim of the Home Secretary, and that is a scary place to be. And it's very scary for some institutions in particular.
Yeah.
Without naming names, everyone knows what we're talking about. That you're just dealing with something that's so fragile. That mix would be so fragile, particularly when it comes to the 1 year master's business course. Right, that's the classic thing. But it's also not. The situation is exacerbated with these sort of changes by the loss of large parts of the private rental and HMO market, which, to be honest, I think universities have for a long time kind of relied on to mop up the bits and bobs, the odd stuff, the stuff that doesn't sort of fit in a nice, neat student accommodation square. Yes, you're coming over with a partner, it's private rentals, HMO, that's where you need to go. You're coming over with children, private rentals, HMO, over there. That stuff's disappearing. So if universities want to be able to serve, more mature students, master students, people coming over for a year to do a course, they're going to have to get real about the range of accommodation options that are available to those students, because the private sector is not going to be there, that local rental market.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there, and you kind of touched on a couple of points there. That, I mean, first around kind of the fickleness of the situation within. I mean, we've seen this year with the problems that Nigerian students are now having with the Nigerian economy, and the of how the expectation is that the numbers of Nigerian students coming over is going to drop. The changes to the visa rules, so from January, that they postgraduate taught will not be able to bring over their families and dependents. So these are all things that either back tinkering with the visa rules, or actual kind of global conditions within those those markets overseas, the economic impacts of what's happening in those countries can have such a profound impact upon a university's financial plan. And how does a university plan for that financially? So I think universities used to be able to plan long term based upon kind of what they understood to be kind of the stability of student numbers used to be quite stable.
Yeah.
Now it's not. And a university can't plan for that now. So, and again, so I think, and then going on to your point around the type of accommodation, that's another thing as well that a university just can't plan for, because again, traditionally what used to work now doesn't work, because the increase in the types of students that universities are now needing to find housing for, either themselves or reliant on the private sector, be that PBSA or PRS, is very different. Whereas before you'd have a lot of undergraduate students who would traditionally go into and be able to afford PBSA, whether that's university PBSA or private PBSA. So the classic, mostly en suites with a smattering of studios, as I call them. That model doesn't necessarily work when you've got an increased number, when your cohort of students is now increasingly being made up of international students coming from these different markets with very different financial profiles.
I agree completely, and I think there needs to be a realization, and I think there is a realization probably, that if there is notionally an optimal blend of accommodation types, that's only an optimal for this precise moment. And in reality, we may have to move off optimal to become more agile. And in the long run, that's actually going to serve us much better in terms of what we're designing and building and what we're providing across the stock. It may not be optimal, but optimal may not exist because we're having to be more flexible. And the other thing that factors into that thinking about provision in the future, I think, is this. It's a long-term shift, but it's not going to reverse. It's the shift towards a more consumerist attitude from the student towards their accommodation provision. And that's, you guys will all have seen it on the ground about the way students raise complaints, the way they, demand certain levels of service, what they feel about when they don't feel like they're getting the service they're paying for. You'll have heard all of those expressions and had all those conversations, so it. In the data, it comes through very clearly when we look at what the factors that drive satisfaction with my student accommodation, which historically used to be all the physical factors. It used to be about how new the building is and whether it's got this feature and that feature, and whether it's another. We're sort of past that into a phase of quite mature as a, if we think of PBSA as a sector, we're at that level of maturity where it's all the soft service stuff that's really driving it. It's about communications within the building. It's about that experience of being an individual. It's the service level. Oh, it's a horrible expression, but it's true, and it's the expectation that comes with selling an international product to international customers and flying them halfway around the world to come and consume it. That's how they feel about it too.
Yeah. I think again, people, please, if you're kind of having thoughts here, just jump in, or type it into the chat. But I think that word agility there, around agility of your accommodation provision, that's a real challenge. So how do you, when you've got an established stock of accommodation that you could get to a point where some of it is no longer working, what do you do then? You're kind of stuck with something. I think there are big questions here for the PBSA sector. At the moment, nobody is building anything. There's a lot of kind of, speculative planning applications going in, but no one's actually committing to anything at this moment in time, because nobody knows what the future of student accommodation need is going to be, and also how do you fund it when the cost per bed is now upwards of around 100,000 per bed. The rental prices on that are just phenomenal, and we can see from the report here that certainly the Nigerian and Indian students can't afford, then that's not the kind of accommodation they're looking for. So coming out to the rest of the group, got a few hands up. Paul, you're on mute, Paul.
I would say whatever you choose to build, don't build it with rack is our experience. We're having a great week. A couple of points on the international student and kind of thoughts on, and it's one of those things where somebody makes a helpful suggestion of somebody should do something, but somebody should, probably CUBO. I think some really good information coming out of this, and in terms of kind of anticipating needs, two points really. Question for Tim. We are finding absolutely that the three groups that you've identified are the growth areas. The Nigerian and Indian students are becoming a bigger proportion than the Chinese students. At one point, 50% of our postgraduate accommodation was taken up with female Chinese students, and that's really dropped. The next biggest group being male Chinese students, and then American postgraduate students. That's really changed, and we're getting a much higher proportion of Nigerian and Indian students. Quite what we do about this question, I don't know, but we are finding that with both these newly emerging categories, finding greater numbers of people just turning up on spec with nothing arranged, arriving in our accommodation office and say, I don't have anything arranged, where do I get a family house? Can I get a room on campus? And we have taken steps based on our experience last year where that change in behaviour really manifested. A lot of messages going to those groups of people to say, don't come, don't bring your family unless you've got accommodation arranged. And I wonder whether that was reflected in this survey in terms of looking at behaviour and experience from the institution's perspective. And we're trying to make arrangements for those. We make some provision for really short to medium term accommodation as far as we can provide. That really challenging at the moment for us in our current circumstances. And the second question was about, well, the comment really, we have started working with Norwich City Planning Office towards shaping accommodation needs where they get a planning application in, and we have started a discussion with them about can they make some provision that could be used for students with families. We're probably typical in that in our city there is a woeful under provision, and where there is provision, I'm afraid to say the feedback we get is that international students are at the back of the queue. They're the last people that landlords want to let to. And I don't think that's for racist reasons at all. I think that is because they're only likely to stay for 1 year, and if they let to somebody who is working rather than studying, they might that tenant might stay with them for the foreseeable future rather than just a 12-month contract. So I've rambled a little bit, but the 2 points there about behaviour on arrival and trying to anticipate that, and then working to try and shape information, perhaps that could come from CUBO, kind of informing about the changes in demand from these emerging groups and where there's a shortfall in accommodation. I take your point, Robin, it's really hard to make new build profitable, and for families that's difficult, but perhaps 3-person cluster flats that could go between 3 students or a small family, I don't know. They need to be self-contained, I think.
Yeah, I mean, on the taking the second point first, I think it's you're doing everything you can do in terms of engaging with the local market, aren't you? But the stories you tell are absolutely reflected in what we know about just the way decision making is met. And as long as there's a shortage of accommodation overall, private operators are going to go for the lowest hanging fruit or the easiest. I mean, some of that's just down to the security of rental guarantors, those sorts of things. It becomes the other issue, of course, is the fees that are paid to brokers for placing international students in accommodation, which can be significant. And that sort of, sorry if I'm jumping around a bit, but that kind of ties back to my response to part one of your first question, which is, I don't think we have enough evidence on that actually at the moment. I think it's an area we could explore more. And in particular, I think, and I don't know what your experience is, but I think we believe that there is a significant difference in the quality of advice given by educational agents. Now, it may not be always that educational agents are involved at all for some of these international students that turn up on spec, but with what we found with Chinese market being relatively well developed, there is a maturity of provision amongst the educational agents who do actually understand to some, the sector to some degree, and are interested in supporting and helping people find accommodation. I don't think that maturity is quite the same there for some of the other markets where there are local agents springing up that are taking money to help students find a course somewhere to go and do and line the visa up, and that's all great. But actually, if they start to flag up the difficulty of finding accommodation, all they're doing is losing a sale. So I think there are a couple of things that need to be investigated there in that whole student through agent university communication information path that definitely needs unpicking. It's definitely something that will be interesting to do.
If I could just come back on that, I just wondered, sorry, I'm really conscious, Simon, I'm keeping you waiting to speak to. Forgive me. I think one of the things we would like to do at UEA is to try and understand from Nigerian and Indian students in particular, is if you were in Nigeria or India, could you expect just to turn up somewhere and get a house within a day? Because it might simply be their experience from where they come from and how it works. People on this call may have a bit of a knowledge of this. It might work like that in their country, and it's just making clear, sorry, I'm putting this very bluntly, but it doesn't work like that in the UK, the demand and supply. I mean, we have had issues in the past where students have wanted to come out of contract between either 2 hours or from our accommodation, because in China, you can get out of a contract much more easily. It's less legally binding. Whether that's still the case or not, I don't know. But I think that's something UEA would like to understand, is their experience will be based on what happens where their country of origin, I think.
I think just very quickly, because I'm going to get Simon in before we finish, is that tying it back to the report, Tim, I think it just suddenly reminded me that if you look at the graph that's included in the report around where the students source their information from, it would indicate that they use official university information much less than home students do for their sources of information. So that might indicate that there is a bit more sort of work to sort of unpick what's going on there, and that's back to your point, Tim, isn't it? Around maybe we need there's a bit more digging to be done there.
And there probably is some quant work that we done, but I feel like there probably is some qualitative work that needs to be done with those particular cohorts as well, that I think would be quite interesting to see. So maybe it's something we can put on the maybe pile for next year, Robin. We can have a chat about that.
Simon.
Thank you. Firstly, apologies. I realised I look very casually dressed for this occasion, so apologies for that. Relaxing at home today, working at home. I think some evidence of the consumer side from ourselves. We had one hall that was predominantly Chinese students and switched very much to an Indian larger group of postgraduate students, and certainly were very much more demanding. It was almost like they'd gone through the website and ticked off all the facilities that were in the building, and then did an audit of when they weren't available to them and when they were available to them, and almost asked for compensation for those minutes. I mean, we had another issue in the building around some of the lifts and things which sort of predicated some of that, but certainly colleagues were suddenly like, well, we didn't have this issue last year when the Chinese students were living there. I was like, well, you have to think of it in an international culture, probably more used to accepting things, come from a very authoritarian regime, whereas these students are paying a lot of money. You get the constant families are supporting them and wider families. So universities want that access from those markets, because we know the Chinese market is not where it was. And, but I think some of us, we have to move on and plan services, and that more individual side very much comes through, certainly with our events program, as we take on more partner halls, trying to work with them closely to deliver a similar experience, rolling residential life out to those halls and things like that. And teams are not expanding as much as they might to support that, but the expectation is we will deliver those similar experiences. And I think that's a huge challenge for the sector. Is this, how can we ensure students are getting that? I mean, we've done individual modules on international students, very much focused around life in the UK, where to spend, careers advice, because it came up in our feedback that they wanted support in finding part-time jobs, and it was very different. So this individualization that needs to go on, it's all right if you've got someone like me who can do some of that work, but it's becoming almost the one size fits all, which I know as mentioned just can't exist anymore, whether it's for home students, international students, almost down to individual countries. So it was more a comment. That's all I wanted to say.
It's a good comment, Simon, and it's I think to some degree we may have been making a rod for our own back with the level of emphasis on service provision and sparkles and bangles, particularly maybe more so in the private side. And I think maybe that's not been such an issue historically with the kind of people we've attracted and demographics we've attracted to those buildings, but it is going to be more of a challenge. I remember speaking to somebody last year in the hotels industry, the hotel sector, and we were just sort of comparing notes really. And she said to me, I was talking about the hotel grading stars and all that sort of stuff. And she said to me, the thing is, you really don't want to be a 5-star hotel. She said, being a 5-star hotel is an absolute nightmare. Everybody wants to be a 4-star hotel. If you're a 5-star hotel, you attract completely the wrong kind of people, and it's a complete nightmare. And I do wonder whether for some international cohorts, what we have accidentally built are some approximating 5-star resorts, which are not necessarily quite living up to the expectation that comes with that.
Okay, so we're nearly at time. I'm not sure we should probably get into, unless anyone's got any sort of final comments or thoughts that they wanted to leave the group with. I fear if I start talking again, we'll get into it, and then we're going to run over time. And I'm sure everyone's very busy and needs to crack on. So I guess sort of thank Tim for his time today. Again, really interesting report. I'd highly recommend, if you haven't read the report in full, do read the report in full, share it, get it out across, don't just sort of keep it within your accommodation teams, send it over to your, international admissions teams, your international support teams, join up with them, have conversations about how you can work together to provide the support and the services, and also to manage the expectation. How do you communicate with the students? So this isn't a report just to be sort of stored away in accommodation teams. This is definitely a report we need to get out across our institutions, right? So yeah, so again, so big thank you, some thanks coming in through the chat, and I guess we'll wrap it up there. Tim, unless you've got any other final thoughts you wanted to finish on.
No, thanks for your time. I know it's super busy. When is it not super busy? It's super busy at the moment.
All the time.
And like I say, a big good luck, Paul. That sounds like you're gonna have a busy time.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know we're all busy. We could have done without RAC, but
yeah,
we are where we are. We're getting there. Thanks all.
All the best, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.